Hello all you crafty friends, this is Debbie from Craft Soup. I'm coming back on today to continue my series on how to make this darling wine bottle gnome, whose structure is a 750 milliliter wine bottle. In the first instructional video, I showed you how to actually take a piece of fabric and cover the bottle, making sure that you slope the fabric up around the slope of the shoulders and covering the bottom with felt and the top with felt. In the next video, we talked about how important it was to cut your fake fur correctly and not just chomp on it. And then I also showed you how to get all of the wrinkles out of the fur so it lays nice and straight like this. Now in this video today, we're going to learn how to take 2 layers of felt that are cut in the hat pattern and change it from this into this. And this on the right includes the black stitching around the edge and some stuffing up and around the hook. Now, if you haven't gone to my Etsy website, which is christmasfestival.etsy.com, you might want to do that. You might want to pick up at least the handout that I've prepared there, because it will show you what the project is supposed to look like and a brief description of it. It'll provide all of the supplies and materials that you'll need to make this gnome, the craft and sewing tools, the skills that are required, and just tips and tricks or things to know before you make your gnome. And then some ideas about how to comb the beard, but most importantly, it has the hat pattern on the back. So you'll definitely want to get that. So let me get some of these things out of my way so I don't tip them over, because since they are made of glass, we do want to be very careful about that. For this tutorial today, you're going to need a couple of things. You're going to need, of course, the hat pattern from the handout. You're going to need to cut that pattern out on 2 back-to-back pieces of felt, which I've done here. By the way, this felt has a little sparkle to it. This is craft felt that I got at Joann's. You want to be careful about getting your felt, because yes, you can get felt at Dollar Tree and it would work fine, but the better felt is at Joann's, where it's just a little bit stiffer, a little bit heavier, and it holds its shape a little bit better. And you can find some felt at Joann's with this little sparkly dust on it. When you put your fabric together, make sure you're putting the 2 plain sides together, and then cut the pattern out around it so that when you're done, you have sparklies on this side, and when you turn it over, you have sparklies on this side. I also forgot to mention that you're going to need some straight pins to hold your 2 pieces of fabric together. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to quickly insert the pins around the edge. It doesn't require many, but you definitely want to match the edges up. And I only use 5 pins. You'll notice that I'm not going down around the point, and that's because I'm not going to sew those 2 flaps together. We need that open to fit over the wine bottle. So what we're going to do is we're going to start here at the point that's underneath the hook. We're going to sew up around the hook to the second point, and all of that way we're sewing 2 layers together. But then when we get to this point, we'll separate the layers and we'll only sew through 1 layer at a time, and we'll finish the hat that way. Let's take it 1 step at a time and let's get started. Okay, you're going to need 2 yards of yarn, and in this case, this particular gnome design is made with black yarn. And you need a sock darning needle with a very fine point. And you are going to want to tie an overhand knot in the end. We're only going to be sewing with just a single strand. We're going to use what I think is called the whip stitch, and what we're going to do is, starting at this corner underneath the hook, we're going to stick the needle in so that it's about a quarter. Let me get a little guide here. It's about a 1/4 of an inch away from this edge, and it's about a 1/4 of an inch away from this edge. And so I'm just going to stick that through and pull it through all the way, and temporarily take out this pin, and I'm going to stick the tail of that yarn that has the knot in it inside the hat so it doesn't show. and then I'm going to stick the pin back in there. Okay, here we go. Now I'm going to take one stitch and come up through that same place. Let's see if I can get this in camera. I'm just going to come right straight back up where I came through before. Don't know if you can see that. All right, and I'm going to pull it through. And when I pull it through, I want it to end up looking like this, so that there's a stitch on the edge that's leading up to the hook. It's a nice, straight, tight, but not overly tight stitch. And that's my anchor stitch. And from this point on, I'm going to move up the edge a little bit, maybe a 3/8 of an inch, maybe a 1/2 inch, I'm not sure. But I'm just going to move up and come up from behind and take another stitch. I'm going to pull it nice and taut, but not tight. I just want to bring up all the slack in it. And now the stitches are starting to look slanted. Okay, here's my second slanted stitch. I came up from behind, and because I'm moving from this place to this place, it brings the yarn up at an angle. All right, and I'm just going to continue going to the back, poking up through the front, and pulling my yarn up. Am I measuring each and every stitch? No, but just eyeball it and make sure that you're not taking too long of a stitch or too short of a stitch. If it's not exactly perfect, you know what? It's going to be okay, because in the end, it's the whole effect that matters. Notice that I'm taking all of my stitches about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. In other words, from here to here, where I'm coming through the felt, is about 1/4 of an inch from the edge to the hole I create. Just take it slow. Try not to get your yarn in a knot like I just did, but if you do, just take the time to unknot it. There we go. Yarn is kind of temperamental that way. Now I'm going to stay on camera while I go up and around this curve, because you might think, oh, how am I ever going to do that? But just ignore the fact that it's a curve. Just keep taking your stitches about 3/8 of an inch along the way. Don't worry that it's a curve. It doesn't matter. It's just the edge that you're paying attention to. Whether it's a straight edge or a curved edge, it doesn't matter. And what you want to do is just relax and have fun doing this, and just go slow. It will be beautiful when you're done, believe me. Now, I just want to stop for a minute and show you that not all of my stitches are exactly even. They're not exactly the same length apart. And in the end, nobody ever notices that, because that edging is so stunning that it's the overall effect that matters. Okay, so I'm just going to keep going here. The curve is going to get a little bit more extreme, but doesn't matter. I'm just going to continue to stitch up and around that curve, pulling the yarn nice and taut. And there's a difference between taut and tight. Taut means that all of the slack is taken out of the yarn. Tight means it's really pulled strongly. If you pull too tight, it might leave a pucker, which you don't want. You want your hat to lay nice and flat. Let me show you what I mean. See, this hat is laying nice and flat. There's no puckering along here. And now comes a curve going in the other direction. We're now at the hook. And when you're in the hook, you're going to take a little bit shorter stitches, because you're going around the reverse curve, and the stitches are going to kind of naturally space themselves out just a little bit further than if you were on a straight edge. See how that's working? They're close here where the holes are, but because they have to go around a long curve, they space themselves out along the edge. Okay, now I'm going to position my left hand in a different place, and I'm just going to keep going around this curve. And I'm going to continue off camera now from this point all the way down to here, and I'll come back and join you again when I'm down here. Okay, as you can see, I've stitched up and around the front, around the hook, over the hump, and I'm coming back down the back now toward this corner. Now I did want to stop and talk about the fact that when we started, we actually started in the part that's the front of the hat. And you know that it's the front because it's underneath the hook. This will be the hook that hangs over his nose. Okay, and I'm heading down the back edge. I'm going to turn this around. And as I come down the back edge and I'm kind of looking ahead toward this corner, I want to plan it out a little bit so that my last stitch is about 1/4 or 3/8 of an inch away from the end of the hat. So just watch what I'm doing. I'll talk you through it here. I'm going to continue to take my stitches along the way here. Again, they're not perfectly spaced. You try to do your best, but as you can see, even though they're not perfect, they're still stunning. I'm going to go for 2 stitches, and they're going to be a little bit shorter than the other ones, and that's okay because it's down on the corner. Okay, this is going to be the last stitch I take on this edge right here. And do you see how it's about 1/4 of an inch away from this edge? I'm going to pull it through. And bring it up nice and taut. Now, the next 2 stitches will be the last 2 stitches I take going through 2 layers of felt, and then I'll start taking stitches only through 1 layer. But let's finish up this corner. So I've just come through on my last stitch of this side, and I'm going to go to the back, and I'm going to go through that same hole one more time to reinforce that corner. Corners can be tricky. I want a nice strong stitch at that corner. Okay, so it looks a little heavy with stitching right there. That's okay, I want that. Then there's nowhere else to stitch. So now I'm going to turn the corner, and I'm going to stick my needle. I'm going to turn this over and show you. Stick the needle in that same hole and turn it over and come up through the same hole on the top and pull it through. And this time I want the stitch to be on this new edge. And doesn't that look nice? It's a nice, strong, reinforced edge right there. And that's how it's supposed to look. Now from this point on, I am going to separate the 2 flaps, and I'm going to continue stitching, but I'm only going to continue stitching on 1 layer of fabric. But I'm going to stitch in the same way that I have been, just taking easy-going stitches about 3/8 of an inch apart from each other. And just so you can see on the finished one, where we're at right now is we've just turned this corner, and now we're heading down this way. So we're on the side flap of the hat. And we're just going to keep stitching along. Now earlier I was talking about the glitter layer on this particular felt at Joann's. Not all colors have the glitter on it, or the sparkly on it. Only some of the colors, but I was fortunate because red is one of the colors, and it really adds to the look of the gnome. It just really makes it a lot more festive. Be careful as you're stitching on the single layer, because it's a lot easier on a single layer to make the edge pucker. and I'm coming down the home stretch of this edge, and I'm looking ahead toward this corner, and just like I did on the last corner, I want to aim so that my last stitch is about 1/4 of an inch away from the next edge. So here's my needle, and it is in fact about 1/4 of an inch away from this next edge. Perfect. All right, and then like we did before, we can take an extra stitch here. This will be the last stitch on this edge for a nice finished look. Just kind of take time to straighten it out. And then turn your fabric, make sure it's not puckering, and you're going to take one more stitch through that same hole. But this time when you pull up the stitch is going to come up on the new edge that we're going to sew on. Okay, and that's what it looks like, and that's what it's supposed to look like. We're going to start stitching up the front of the gnome's hat across the nose bridge. This is the nose bridge right here. This will be where the little wood knob sits under this seam. And then we're just going to keep going past it and go down the next edge. So here we go. I do love this black on the red. Okay, now I'm coming up to the seam. And you're probably wondering, oh, how's she going to do that? Well, let me tell you. What I'm going to do here is I'm aiming to space these stitches out so that the next stitch I take comes up through that hole that I've already put in from the very first stitch I took. Can you see that? See how my needle's coming up right there, right there. And it's coming up through the very first stitch I took in this hat. All right, so here I go. I'm going to pull it through. And I've pulled too tightly, so I'm going to loosen it up. And I know that I pulled too tightly because it's kind of puckering. No problem. I'm just going to take the time to pull it out a little bit. That looks nice. Now, this is kind of I wouldn't say tricky, but it's just something you have to pay attention to. There's a little space between those two sides, and I'm going to move my yarn down into it, and I'm going to come up through the hole on the other side of the hat. And that's how it's supposed to look. So I'm not sure if you can see it, but the yarn went up and in between the two flaps, and then I stuck my needle into this new flap, and it came out of that hole that already had a stitch in it. And now I'm just going to continue making my stitches. And I'm going to go ahead and do this off camera. When I get to this corner, I'm going to do the same thing as I did on this corner, and then I'm going to move back up. This will be the last edge I stitch on, and then I'll show you how to finish it off. Okay, my friends, as you can see, I'm coming up close now to the end of my stitching project, because if I turn this over, the other side is already stitched, as you can see. So what I want to do is project ahead and see if I can get really close to this hole right here. I think I've got probably one stitch and then the last stitch to take. I think that'll work out perfectly. And again, when I'm sewing on these side flaps, I'm only sewing on an individual layer. Okay, so I'm going to take one stitch here, and then my last stitch through that same hole that I've already stitched through when I was sewing on that edge. Okay. Notice where my yarn is coming out. It's coming out very close to that hole right there. I'm going to just cross the bridge and go, and keeping the two layers apart, I'm going to stick my needle in on the other side and have it come out, only one layer. So I'm just going across that little seam, just for stability. Now notice that the yarn is coming out of the inside of the hat. I've got the hat opened up, and this is the inside. And now what I want to do is I just want to finish off. I pull the two flaps apart just enough so I can see the stitches on the inside of the hat. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go up a couple of the stitches and just sew right through them, pulling the yarn taut but not tight. And then I'm going to stitch through the last stitch I stitched through. Let me see if I can make this easy to see. And I'm going to head up to the next stitch and sew through it, not pulling too tight, and then I'm going to stitch through that last stitch one more time. There's no need to tie a knot because when this is all done, it's going to have no pressure on this end at all. This hat is going to be glued in place. Nobody's going to be tugging on this or pulling out yarn or anything, so it's just fine in there. Believe me, I've made hundreds of these and the stitching has never come undone. So now, as you can see, I cut off the yarn, leaving about an inch on there, and we have a beautiful hat. And you know what? If you look at it closely, you'll see some stitches that are longer than others, but the overall effect is just stunning. And that's what you're going for. Okay, the next step is to take some fiber fill or some cotton, whatever you have, and stuff it up into that hook because that gives it body. Let me show you on the real one. See how it's stuffed up here? It's nice and stuffed like a stuffed doll or a stuffed animal. And the top of the bottle is just right about here. But then what keeps this nice and sturdy up here is the stuffing. So let's do it. For this, you're going to need some polyfill or fiber fill, whatever it's called at your store, and a blunt end of a pen or a pencil. To work that fiber fill into this very end of the hook, I'm just going to work with a little bit at a time. See how little I'm working with? And I'm just going to stuff it in there actually with my fingers, and I can feel it in there, and I'm going to just round the corner up there, round the curve, and there gets a point where my finger won't go any further, and that's where you stick the blunt end of a pen or a pencil, and you just keep pushing that fiber fill all the way to the end. And you can see now that the end has a little bump in it. That's where the fiber fill is. All right, so then we're going to take a little bit more. Not too much more because we're still working in a very tiny space in that hook. And I'm just going to push it up there with my finger. And I'm going to bend my finger if I can around that hook. And I'm sorry it's hard to show you this, but I think you get the idea. My finger is bending around that corner. And then I just take the blunt end of my pen, stick it up there, and make sure that the polyfill is in place. I don't want to press real hard. I don't want to undo my stitching or tear the felt. Now I've filled up the end of the hat about that much where my thumb is. But I want to come down and fill up the top 2.5 to 3 inches, probably 2.5 inches with the polyfill. So I'm going to keep just doing a little bit at a time. If you take a big piece of polyfill and try to stuff it up there, you're going to get a really lumpy look to your hat. And you don't want to do that. Just work with little bits at a time. It gives you a lot more control. Okay, and now I'm at a place where I don't need the pen anymore because my finger is fitting up into the hat where I'm working. And right now I've filled up the hat to about here with polyfill. But I want to come down to about here. So I'm going to just keep stuffing it in there. And a little more. I get this polyfill at Joann's by the bag because I use it. I make so many of these gnomes. All right, there's a little bit more, and it's feeling very nice and even in there, very sturdy. I'm loving how it's looking. It's not lumpy or bumpy, very smooth. It's not going to take much more. Let's see here. Okay, it's coming down to about right here, and if I measure from the top of the hat to where I've stuffed the polyfill, I'm probably at about 2.5 inches. So I think I'll stop. And remember, you can always add more before you do the final attachment of this hat. So let's see how this is going to work. Okay, here's the back of my bottle. I'm going to turn that to the back. I'm going to open up my hat. I'm going to bring it down over the bottle. I'm not going to test this with the beard. I'm just testing it to see if I've put enough fiber fill or polyfill in there. And yes, I can feel where the top of the bottle is and where my fiber fill comes to. And you know what? There's just a little empty space right there. I'm just going to put a teeny bit more in there because I don't want a little indentation right there where there's no fiber fill. So I'm going to just take this off, take just a little bit more fiber fill and put it up there. Stuffing it nice and tight. And if you remember, we put a piece of red felt here. We glued it on the top of the bottle, and that's because when we put the hat on, we don't want the polyfill falling down into the middle of the bottle. So that's why we closed that top of the bottle off. And now I am really happy with this. There's a lot of fiber fill all the way up to the top of the bottle. You can't see the top edge of the bottle. That's exactly what I want. We're not ready to glue it on yet. That's coming, but we're getting close. So today we learned that for some of this hat, you sew through 2 layers, and then for the 2 flaps at the bottom, you sew through 1 layer. You reinforce the corners. You don't have to tie a knot when you finish it off. And we also learned that the stitches don't have to be perfectly spaced to be beautiful. I hope you're inspired. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, give it a thumbs up. That would mean the world to me. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please hit the subscribe button. And if you'll hit that notification button too, then you'll get notified when I upload new videos. My friends, this has been a lot of fun, one of the funnest videos I've made. So thanks for your patience while you waited for me to come back on. I will see you next time, and we'll learn how to embellish this hat with a little glittered snowflake. All right, we'll see you then. Bye-bye.